Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the final birthday of Joe Gallo. It is the 7th of April, 1972. Close your eyes and let the frantic pulse of the modern world fade into a distant, muffled echo. Imagine the air as it felt then, heavy, cool, and thick, with the scent of a city that never truly rests. A fine, misty drizzle has settled over Manhattan, turning the asphalt of the streets into a dark, shimmering mirror that catches the amber glow of the streetlights. The year is 1972, a time when the city was draped in a different kind of velvet, where the shadows felt longer, and the secrets were buried deep beneath the cobblestones of the Lower East Side. Can you feel the dampness on your skin? Can you hear the rhythmic, lonely hiss of tires on wet pavement? We are traveling back to a night of celebration and shadows, to the very heart of Little Italy, where the brick walls seem to lean in close to whisper their stories. Take a long, deep breath, and let the weight of the present lift away as we find ourselves standing on the corner of Mulberry and Hester Streets. Before we reach the corner, we must look back at the earlier hours of this evening. Joe Gallo was celebrating his 43rd year on this earth, and the night began with the glitter and smoke of the Copacabana nightclub. Picture the room, swathed in deep reds and golds, the air swirling with the sophisticated scents of expensive tobacco and French perfume. Joe sat at a premier table, surrounded by his closest circle, including his new wife, Sina, and the famous actor Jerry Orbach. The legendary comedian Don Rickles was on stage, his sharp, raspy voice cutting through the laughter of the crowd. Even as the comedian roasted him from the spotlight, Joe laughed, his eyes bright and his spirit high. The tuxedoed waiters moved with a practiced, silent grace, their silver trays catching the dim, warm light of the table lamps. There was a sense of arrival in the air, a feeling that the danger of the past decade was finally receding. But as the clock moved toward the early morning hours, toward 4 o'clock, the group decided the night was not yet over. They wanted something familiar, something that tasted like home. They left the glamour of the club and stepped out into the quiet, rain-washed night, hailed a yellow checker cab with its worn vinyl seats, and headed south toward the narrow, winding veins of the neighborhood. The transition from the Midtown lights to the shadows of Little Italy is a slow, hypnotic descent. The buildings grow shorter, their red brick faces weathered by decades of salt air and wood smoke. We arrive at Umberto's Clam house, an establishment that had been open for only a few short weeks. It sits prominently on the corner, its windows glowing with a soft, inviting light that spills out onto the damp sidewalk. Joe leads the way, his hand resting on the cold, heavy brass handle of the door. As it swings open, the chill of the April night is replaced by a wave of warmth and the intoxicating aroma of a traditional Italian kitchen. The air is thick with the scent of garlic sautéed in golden olive oil, the briny tang of fresh seafood, and the sweet, rich notes of red wine. The floor is a mosaic of cool, white tiles, and the furniture consists of heavy, solid butcher block tables that feel as though they were built to last a century. The restaurant is nearly empty at this hour, 4:30 in the morning, creating a sanctuary of quiet and comfort. The only sounds are the distant hum of the refrigerators and the soft, rhythmic clatter of the kitchen staff preparing the late-night orders. Joe and his family settle at a table in the back. There is a sense of profound intimacy in their movements. Sina sits beside him, her daughter nearby, and his sister Carmela across the table. His loyal bodyguard, Peter, whom everyone calls the Greek, takes his place, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the door, though the atmosphere is one of relaxed celebration. Joe is in high spirits, leaning back in his wooden chair, the light from the neon sign in the window casting a soft, rhythmic red pulse across his face. He is 43 today. He orders the house specialties, platters of scungilli, calamari, and mussels, all steaming and fragrant. When the food arrives, it is a sensory feast. The scungilli is tender, bathed in a spicy marinara that warms the chest. The mussels are piled high, their dark shells glistening under the overhead lights. Joe reaches for a piece of crusty Italian bread, the surface rough and dusted with flour, and uses it to soak up the savory juices on his plate. The red wine is poured into thick glasses, the liquid a deep, dark garnet color. They toast to his health, the sound of the glass clinking together a small, bright note of joy in the stillness of the room. It is a moment of absolute peace, a rare pocket of safety where the man known as a warrior of the streets can simply be a husband, a brother, and a father. As they eat, the world outside seems to vanish. The misty rain continues to fall on Mulberry Street, washing the day's grit into the gutters. Inside Umberto's, the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates provides a soothing soundtrack to their conversation. Joe sits with his back to the door, a gesture of trust, or perhaps a temporary surrender to the joy of the moment. He watches his daughter, his expression softening in a way the public never sees. The steam from the seafood rises in delicate, swirling ribbons toward the ceiling, carrying with it the essence of the ocean and the heat of the stove. The restaurant staff moves quietly in the background, the soft scuff of their shoes on the tile floor barely audible. Everything feels permanent, grounded, and safe. The shadows in the corners of the room are soft, not threatening. The neon sign outside flickers once-twice, casting its crimson glow over the empty tables near the front. It is the quietest time in the city, the hour when the night is at its deepest, and the morning is still just a promise on the horizon. Here, in this pocket of 1972, the air is still. The birthday wish has been made, the wine has been tasted, and for these final few minutes of the early morning, the world is exactly as it should be. The cobblestone streets of Red Hook in the early 1930s were slick with a peculiar, heavy grease, a mixture of harbor salt, coal dust, and the spilled remains of 1,000 illegal barrels. It was here, amidst the towering skeletons of the Brooklyn docks, that Joseph Gallo first learned the rhythm of the shadows. He was born on April 7, 1929, into a world where the air was thick with the scent of his father Umberto's bootleg whiskey and the iron tang of the nearby shipyards. Growing up in a brick tenement, the young Joseph watched as his father transitioned from the frantic energy of prohibition to the calculated chill of loan sharking. The kitchen table was not just a place for Sunday sauce. It was where the ledgers were balanced, where the weight of debt was measured in whispered threats and crumpled bills. Joe and his brothers, Larry and Albert, moved through these rooms like ghosts in training, absorbing the cold reality that in their world, respect was a currency more valuable than gold, and silence was the only armor worth wearing. By the time the 1950s arrived, Joseph had become a figure of high contrast edges and restless energy. He was no longer just the bootlegger's son. He was becoming the man the papers would eventually call Crazy Joe. But to those who knew him on President Street, he was a study in contradictions. He would sit in the dim light of their headquarters at number 51, a 3-story brick building they called the dormitory, surrounded by the mechanical clicking of jukeboxes and the heavy, sweet scent of cigars. Inside that building, the air felt different. It was a fortress where the Gallo brothers carved out a kingdom that refused to bow to the stiff, old-world traditions of the Mafia Commission. In the basement, the darkness was punctuated by a sound that felt entirely out of place for a Brooklyn basement. The low, vibrating growl of Cleo, a full-grown lioness that Joe kept as a pet. He would feed her raw meat while leaning against the cold stone walls, the animal's presence a living metaphor for his own untamed, predatory nature. The sound of her claws clicking on the concrete was a rhythmic reminder that the Gallos were not interested in blending into the scenery. Joe's reputation as a nonconformist wasn't just about the lion or the leather jackets he favored. He was a man who found his reflection in the dark corners of Greenwich Village, drifting through jazz clubs where the music was jagged and the poetry was experimental. while other mobsters spent their nights in social clubs eating pasta and playing cards. Joe was reading Camus and Sartre, his mind wandering through the existentialist landscapes of rebellion. He began to dress like a character from a film noir, specifically imitating the shivering, high-pitched menace of Tommy Udo from the movie Kiss of Death. He would tilt his hat low, his eyes bright with a sharp, schizophrenic intensity that kept even his closest associates on edge. This wasn't the behavior of a standard soldier in the Profaci crime family. He was a rebel who happened to be a hitman, a philosopher who knew the weight of a .38 caliber revolver in the palm of his hand. He looked at the old bosses, the mustache Petes, with their heavy gold rings and their rigid codes of conduct, and he saw a dying world that he was more than willing to bury. The turning point, the moment that etched his name into the stone of criminal history, came on a crisp morning on October 25, 1957. The setting was the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel, a place of white marble and the soothing hum of electric clippers. Albert Anastasia, the feared head of Murder Incorporated, sat in chair number 4, his eyes closed beneath a warm, damp towel. The air smelled of expensive bay rum and peppermint steam. Suddenly, the glass doors swung open, and the serenity of the room was shattered. 2 men, their faces obscured by scarves, burst in with the clinical precision of ghosts. They shoved the barber aside and opened fire, the deafening cracks of the handguns echoing off the tiled walls. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, stood up in a final, instinctive surge of life, reaching for the shadows of his attackers reflected in the mirror before collapsing onto the checkered floor. It was whispered in every dark corner of the city that Joe Gallo was one of those gunmen. He would later brag about it with a chilling, poetic flair, calling his crew the Barbershop Quintet. The hit didn't just remove a rival. It announced that the President Street boys were no longer content with the scraps from the table. They wanted the whole feast. But with great power came a deepening resentment toward the man at the top of their family, Joe Profaci. Profaci was an old-school patriarch who ruled with a heavy hand and a bottomless appetite for tribute. He demanded a massive cut of every dollar the Gallo brothers earned from their jukeboxes, their cigarette machines, and their sweatshops in the garment district. To Joe Gallo, this wasn't just business. It was an insult to his autonomy. He watched as his brother Larry worked 18-hour days, only to hand over the lion's share of the profits to a man who lived in a palatial estate, while they stayed in the grit of Red Hook. The tension began to simmer like a pot left too long on the flame. Joe would pace the floors of the dormitory, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the rooms filled with guns and stolen goods. He felt the squeeze of the old world tightening around his neck, and he knew that a single spark would be enough to ignite a war. He wasn't just fighting for money anymore. He was fighting against the very idea of being a subordinate. The President Street rebel was preparing to do the unthinkable. He was going to kidnap the leadership of the very family he was sworn to serve, setting the stage for a conflict that would turn the streets of Brooklyn into a velvet-draped graveyard. The rebellion against the old guard was momentarily frozen in time on the 21st of December, 1961. As the cold winter wind whipped through the gray corridors of the New York courtroom, the heavy oak doors swung shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Joe stood there, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights, as the judge handed down a sentence of 7 to 14 years for conspiracy and extortion. The world of the Red Hook docks and the smoke-filled social clubs vanished, replaced by the sterile, biting scent of industrial floor wax and the rhythmic clinking of heavy metal shackles. He was moved from the familiar streets to the towering, jagged shadows of Green Haven Correctional Facility. The transition was jarring. The sounds of the city were replaced by the hollow groan of steel sliding against steel, a symphony of confinement that would define the next decade of his life. In the silence of those first few nights, the only sound was the distant drip of a leaky pipe and the pacing of leather boots on concrete, marking the beginning of a transformation that few in the underworld could have ever predicted. While his brothers, Larry and Albert, remained on the outside, navigating the bloody fallout of their war with the Profaci family, Joe retreated into the stillness of the prison library. It was a cavernous room, filled with the scent of decaying paper and the dry, powdery dust of unread volumes. Here, the man the world called crazy Joe began to rebuild himself from the inside out. He spent hours hunched over small wooden tables, his fingers tracing the rough, yellowed pages of books by Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Friedrich Nietzsche. He read 8 books a day, his mind absorbing the complexities of the human condition and the cold, hard logic of the absurd. He became fascinated by Machiavelli, seeing the mirrors of the mafia's power structures in the political machinations of the 16th century. The concrete walls of his cell were no longer just a cage, they became a classroom. He would speak to his fellow inmates about Hegel's dialectic with the same fluid, casual ease he used when describing a street-side execution. His voice, once used only for threats and orders, began to take on a lyrical, intellectual quality, weaving together the philosophy of the existentialists with the brutal realities of the criminal life. Joe's intellectual curiosity extended far beyond the pages of philosophy books. It moved into the very social fabric of the prison yard. In the 1960s, the racial lines of the American penal system were drawn in iron and blood, yet Joe walked across them with a defiant indifference that unsettled both the guards and his fellow mobsters. He found a kindred spirit in Leroy Nicky Barnes, a rising power in the Harlem drug trade. They would sit together in the pale, filtered sunlight of the yard, their low-toned conversations drifting through the air like smoke. Joe looked at the world and saw a shifting tide, predicting that the traditional power of the Italian families would soon be challenged by the growing organizations in Harlem. He coached Barnes on the intricacies of structural discipline, sharing the secrets of the old world to help build a new one. This alliance was viewed as a betrayal by the other Cosa Nostra inmates, who watched from the shadows, whispering the name the criminal as a slur against the man who refused to abide by their ancient, segregated codes. Joe merely smiled, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, as he continued to bridge worlds that were never meant to meet. This defiance led to a legendary legal battle in 1964, when Joe sued the New York Department of Corrections. The dispute began over something as simple as a haircut. Joe had requested that a black barber cut his hair, a request that the prison administration met with swift and harsh punishment, citing it as an act of agitation. Joe viewed the ensuing solitary confinement as a badge of honor, a testament to his rejection of a system he considered intellectually bankrupt. Later, after being transferred to Auburn Correctional Facility, the quietude of his studies was shattered by the roar of a prison riot. Amidst the screams and the thick, acrid smell of smoke from burning mattresses, Joe did something unexpected. He moved through the chaos, not to join the violence, but to rescue a severely wounded corrections officer, pulling the man to safety as the world around them dissolved into madness. It was a moment of profound contradiction, the violent enforcer acting as a savior, and it earned him the respect of the very men who kept him behind bars. The officer would later testify on Joe's behalf at his parole hearing, describing a man who was far more complex than the headlines had ever suggested. In the final years of his sentence, Joe turned his focus to the delicate art of watercolor painting. He would sit by the small window of his workspace in the woodworking shop, where he served as an elevator operator. The air was thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and the sharp tang of turpentine. With a steady hand, he mixed pigments, creating soft, ethereal landscapes that seemed a world away from the grit of Red Hook. He painted with a meticulous attention to detail, his brushes moving across the paper with a grace that mirrored his newfound eloquence. He began to envision a life beyond the mob, one involving the theater and the literati of Manhattan. He spoke of writing plays in the style of Jean Genet, casting himself as the lead in a drama of his own making. But as the date of his release in April 1971 drew closer, the shadows of his past remained long and reaching. Behind the newfound intellectualism and the delicate paintings, the same fire that had fueled the war against prophecy still burned. He was an evolved man, but the streets he was returning to were colder and more fractured than the ones he had left 10 years before. The iron gates of the prison groaned with a weight that seemed to carry the echoes of a decade. On the 11th of April, 1971, Joe Gallo stepped out into a world that had moved on without him, yet was strangely prepared for his return. The air outside was different from the recycled, sterile draft of the cell blocks. It was thick with the scent of exhaust, the salt of the Atlantic, and the restless energy of a New York City spring. Joe himself was changed. Those who met him at the gate saw a man who had been carved thin by time. He was frail, his skin the color of old parchment, a stark contrast to the vibrant watercolors he had left behind in his cell. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been synonymous with raw, kinetic violence. But his eyes, those piercing, icy blue eyes, remained as sharp as a razor edge. They flickered with a predatory intelligence, scanning the horizon of the city he still considered his kingdom. He was 42 years old, and though his body looked as if it had withered under the harsh, fluorescent lights of Auburn and Attica, his spirit was coiled like a spring, waiting for the right moment to snap back into the rhythm of the streets. The New York he found was a tinderbox, and Joe was more than willing to strike the match. While he had been away, the power dynamics of the five families had shifted into something loud and performative. Joe Colombo had risen to the top, but he wasn't staying in the shadows like the bosses of old. He had founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, turning the quiet business of the underworld into a public spectacle of rallies and picket lines. To the traditionalists, it was a dangerous vanity. To Joe Gallo, it was an opportunity. Shortly after his release, a peace offering was sent his way, a gesture meant to fold the old rebel back into the ranks. It was $1,000. To a man who had spent 10 years in a cage, it wasn't just a small amount of money. It was a calculated insult. Joe didn't just reject it. He threw it back with a demand that sent ripples of cold dread through the social clubs of South Brooklyn. He wanted $100,000 to stay quiet. He wanted his respect back, paid in full and with interest. The city felt the pressure rising, like the heavy, humid air before a summer thunderstorm, as two men named Joe began a dance of death that would leave the streets stained in red. The heat of June 28, 1971, was stifling. In Columbus Circle, thousands of people gathered for the second annual Italian-American Unity Day rally. The air was filled with the sound of brass bands, the smell of street food, and the chanting of a crowd that felt invincible. Joe Colombo moved through the press of bodies with the confidence of a king, flanked by his sons and a phalanx of bodyguards. He was approaching the stage, ready to speak to his followers, when the world fractured. A young man named Jerome Johnson, disguised as a member of the press with a camera dangling from his neck, stepped forward. He didn't reach for a lens. He reached for a pistol. 3 shots rang out, sharp and sudden against the festive music. 1, 2, 3. The bullets found their mark in Colombo's head and neck. The scene dissolved into a nightmare of screaming and blood. Amidst the chaos, Johnson was tackled and, seconds later, shot dead by an unidentified person in the crowd. Colombo was rushed to the hospital, his life hanging by a thread that would never fully knit back together. He would survive, but he would remain a ghost in his own body, paralyzed and silent for the rest of his days. And as the news hit the radio waves, every eye in the city turned toward the man they called Crazy Joe. The suspicion was immediate, yet impossible to pin down. Joe Gallo had spent his time in prison cultivating friendships that crossed the deep racial divides of the era. He had walked the yards with men the other bosses wouldn't even look at. Because the shooter at Columbus Circle was a black man, the narrative wrote itself in the minds of the Colombo family. Joe had used his new connections to strike at the heart of the family without ever pulling a trigger himself. The police brought him in for questioning, the white lights of the interrogation room reflecting in his calm, unblinking eyes. He offered them nothing but a smirk. He was a man who understood the power of a legend, and the legend of the Columbus Circle hit was growing by the hour. But Joe wasn't hiding in a basement or a fortified social club. Instead, he did something even more defiant. He stepped into the spotlight of New York high society. He began to frequent the theater district, dining at Sardi's and making friends with the city's intellectuals and artists. He was the mobster as a folk hero, quoting philosophy and discussing art with celebrities like Jerry Orbach. To the world, he was a reformed poet. To the streets, he was a man walking through a minefield with a cigarette in his hand. The atmosphere in Little Italy became suffocating. When Joe walked into a restaurant, the conversation didn't just stop, it evaporated. You could hear the clink of silverware against porcelain, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, and the heavy heartbeat of men who knew that a war was no longer coming. It was already here. Dark cars with tinted windows began to sit at the corners of Mulberry Street, their engines idling in a low, predatory hum. Joe took no precautions. He refused to live like a man afraid, perhaps believing that his new celebrity status acted as a shield, or perhaps simply not caring if the end was near. He married his second wife, Sina, in a whirl of romance that seemed like a frantic attempt to grab at life before the shadows closed in. He was a man living on borrowed time, and the interest was coming due. The storm clouds that had been gathering since his release were now a wall of black on the horizon. Every laugh in a dimly lit club, every hand shaken in the street, and every night spent celebrating his newfound freedom was a step closer to the early morning hours of his 43rd birthday. The stage was set for a final, violent act in a house known for its clams and its quiet, tucked-away tables. The morning of April 7th, 1972, arrived with a heavy, damp silence that seemed to press against the brickwork of Little Italy. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, that peculiar hour when the city of New York holds its breath between the fading echoes of the night and the first gray stirrings of the day. The street lamps along Mulberry Street cast long, amber shadows that stretched across the uneven cobblestones, their light flickering slightly in the humid air. After a long night of celebration at the Copacabana, where the laughter of the crowd and the sharp wit of the comedians still rang in his ears, Joe Gallo felt a rare sense of ease. He was 43 years old today, a milestone reached against all odds in a world where the life expectancy of men like him was often cut short by a single, sudden moment of violence. The air was cool as the party stepped out of their cars, the scent of the nearby river mixing with the lingering aroma of expensive cigars and the perfume of the women. They walked toward the corner of Mulberry and Hester Streets, where the neon sign of Umberto's Clam house hummed with a low, electric vibration, its red and white glow reflecting in the shallow puddles left by a recent mist. This was supposed to be neutral ground, a place where the rules of the street were suspended in favor of a late-night meal among family and friends. Joe felt safe enough to let his guard slip, just an inch, as he guided his wife, Sina, and her 10-year-old daughter, Lisa, toward the entrance. Inside, Umberto's was a small, brightly lit sanctuary of maritime kitsch and Italian comfort. The walls were adorned with tangled fishing nets, decorative oars, and mounted fish that stared blankly at the few patrons scattered throughout the room. The floor was a scuffed checkerboard of linoleum, and the air was thick with the intoxicating, heavy scents of garlic, butter, and simmering seafood. Joe and his party took 2 tables near the back of the restaurant, in a move that would later be scrutinized by every investigator in the city. Joe sat with his back to the side door. A rare, perhaps fatal, lapse in the survival instincts that had kept him alive through decades of mob warfare. They ordered the house specialties: skungilly, calamari, and mussels, the plates arriving with the steam rising in white plumes against the fluorescent lights. There was a rhythmic clatter of silverware against ceramic, the sound of water being poured into glasses, and the low, muffled murmur of conversation. Pete the Greek, Joe's loyal bodyguard, sat nearby, his eyes scanning the room, but even he seemed softened by the domesticity of the scene. They were just a family eating a birthday meal in the quietest hour of the morning. But outside, in the shadows across the street, the atmosphere was shifting. A man had seen them enter, a man who knew exactly what Joe Gallo's presence in Little Italy meant, and the machinery of a hit had already begun to turn, silent and inevitable. The transition from peace to chaos happened with the slow-motion clarity of a dream. One moment, Joe was reaching for a piece of bread, the crust crackling between his fingers, and the next, the side door of the Clam house creaked open. A draft of cold, early-morning air rushed into the warm restaurant, carrying with it the smell of exhaust and wet pavement. 3 men stepped into the light, their silhouettes dark and jagged against the street outside. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. The lead gunman, a man later identified by many as Carmine Di Bias, moved with a terrifying, mechanical precision. The first shot was not the deafening roar one might expect, but a sharp, clinical pop that shattered the domestic quiet. It was followed instantly by a second, then a third. The sound of glass breaking was like 1,000 diamonds falling onto a hard floor. The scent of gunpowder, metallic and acrid, instantly overwhelmed the smell of the garlic and wine. Time seemed to stretch and thin, pulling the moments apart. Joe didn't scream. His first instinct, honed by a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, was not for himself. He lunged across the table, his heavy frame moving to shield Sina and little Lisa, his hands reaching out to shove them toward the floor, into the safety of the shadows beneath the red and white checkered tablecloth. He was the target, and he knew that if he stayed at the table, the bullets intended for him would find the people he loved. With a grunt of effort, Joe flipped the heavy wooden table, the plates of half-eaten seafood sliding off and smashing into the floor, a mess of red sauce and white porcelain. He scrambled toward the front door, drawing the attention of the gunmen away from the back of the room. It was a desperate, calculated run. Bullets tore into the upholstery of the chairs and thudded into the walls, sending plaster dust into the air like a fine, gray snow. One round caught him in the elbow, another in the buttocks, and a third tore through his back, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins pushed him forward. He lurched toward the front of the restaurant, his breathing heavy and ragged. The gunmen continued to fire, their muzzle flashes illuminating the room in rhythmic, terrifying bursts of light. Pete the Greek had managed to draw his own weapon, returning fire in a frantic attempt to cover his boss, the air now filled with a cacophony of nearly 20 shots. The small restaurant had become a slaughterhouse of sound and flying debris. Joe reached the front door, his body heavy and failing, and threw himself against the glass. The plate glass shattered with a magnificent, terrible sound, a crystalline roar that announced his arrival on the sidewalk. He stumbled out into the cool air of Mulberry Street, his suit jacket stained dark, his footsteps leaving a crimson trail on the pale concrete. He managed to stagger 15 feet into the middle of the intersection where Hester Street meets Mulberry. The city was still quiet, the sirens of the police and ambulances only just beginning to wail in the far distance. Joe collapsed there, his knees hitting the cold, damp asphalt first, followed by the weight of his torso. He lay on his back, looking up at the sky as the first hints of dawn began to bleed through the dark blue of the night. The towering tenements of Little Italy rose up around him, their windows dark and unseeing. Within seconds, the silence returned, broken only by the frantic footsteps of his family as they ran out from the restaurant to find him. Sina knelt by his side, her hands pressing against his wounds, her voice a desperate whisper in the morning air. Pete the Greek stood over them, his gun still in his hand, his eyes darting around for a threat that had already vanished into the maze of lower Manhattan. The gunmen had disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the smell of spent shells and the ruin of a birthday dinner. Joe's eyes flickered, the light of the street lamps fading as his pulse slowed. By the time the patrolmen from the Elizabeth Street station arrived, the man known as Crazy Joe was a ghost of himself. His life's blood pooling in the middle of the street, he had once ruled with such an iron, unpredictable hand. The Clam House hit was over, but the echoes of those 20 shots were destined to ring through the streets of New York for years to come. The echo of the final gunshot lingered in the narrow corridors of Little Italy long after the black Cadillac had vanished into the morning mist. On the corner of Hester and Mulberry, the air was thick with the heavy, salty scent of garlic and cooling clam sauce, now mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Joey Gallo lay on the cold, damp pavement, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that puffed like white ghosts in the pre-dawn chill. The streetlights above flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing hum, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones. Around him, the city was beginning to stir, but it was a muffled, fearful awakening. The neon sign of Umberto's Clam House hummed a low, electric tune, its red and green light reflecting in the dark pools gathering on the sidewalk. Within minutes, the silence was fractured by the distant, wailing rise of sirens, a sound that seemed to crawl through the maze of brick buildings, growing louder and more insistent until the first flash of red and blue light painted the brickwork in rhythmic pulses of emergency. 2 patrolmen from the 5th Precinct arrived to find a scene frozen in a chaotic tableau. They saw the shattered glass of the restaurant door, sparkling like diamonds cast across the dark ground, and the heavy butcher block table overturned inside, its legs pointing toward the ceiling like a felled beast. The world of Crazy Joey, once so loud and defiant, was shrinking into the quiet, clinical reality of a crime scene. As the sun began to pull its gray fingers over the horizon on that April morning in 1972, the investigation into the death of Joseph Gallo began with a wall of absolute, crushing silence. Detectives moved through the interior of the restaurant, their footsteps heavy on the sawdust-covered floor. They found the discarded shells of 20 bullets, tiny brass cylinders that glinted under the beams of their flashlights. They moved from table to table, but the 9 other customers who had been dining, just moments before the shooting, had vanished into the shadows of the neighborhood like smoke in a breeze. Those who remained, the waiters with their white aprons stained by more than just red sauce, the cook standing in the back with trembling hands, offered only hollow gazes and shaking heads. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. The code of silence, that ancient and unwritten law of the streets, had descended over Mulberry Street as surely as the morning fog. Even Pete the Greek, Joey's loyal shadow who had fired back until his own weapon was empty, sat in the back of a police cruiser with a jaw set like granite. His eyes remained fixed on some distant point, refusing to acknowledge the officers who pressed him for names, for descriptions, for any thread they could pull to unravel the mystery of the gunmen who had walked through the side door and changed the course of the city's underworld in less than 30 seconds. At Beekman Downtown Hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile, unforgiving brightness. Doctors worked with a frantic, rhythmic efficiency, but by 5:30 in the morning, the struggle was over. Joseph Gallo, the man who had survived the bloody wars of the 1960s and the harsh winters of Attica, was pronounced dead on his 43rd birthday. Outside the hospital doors, the press began to gather, their camera flashes popping like miniature explosions against the graying sky. The legend of the man who kept a lion in his basement and read philosophy in his prison cell was already beginning to morph into something else. A ghost story told in the back booths of social clubs. Detectives like Joe Coffey spent weeks sifting through the wreckage of Joey's life, searching for a single witness who would speak a name aloud. They followed a trail that led to a man named Joseph Luparelli, who fled to California in a state of blind, shaking paranoia, eventually whispering to the Federal Bureau of Investigation that 4 men had carried out the hit. But whispers were not evidence. Without corroboration, without a weapon, and without a single soul in Little Italy willing to point a finger, the case began to grow cold. The files were tucked away in metal cabinets, the ink on the reports fading as the months turned into years, leaving the truth buried beneath the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. The funeral at St. Bernadette's Church in Brooklyn was a somber, muted affair. A heavy rain began to fall, a steady drumming against the black umbrellas that clustered like the carapaces of beetles along the sidewalk. There were no grand speeches, no theatrical displays of grief from the rival families. Instead, there was a palpable sense of an era ending. The Gallo brothers had been the wild cards, the rebels who dared to stare down the commission and demand a seat at a table that was never meant for them. With Joey gone, the fiery energy of the crew began to dissipate. His brother Albert, known as Kid Blast, attempted to keep the flame alive, but the shadows were growing longer. The streets of South Brooklyn, once the stage for their boldest acts, began to change. The old social clubs were shuttered, their windows boarded up or replaced by the bright, sterile storefronts of a new generation. The name Gallo, once spoken with a mixture of terror and awe, started to drift into the realm of folklore. People remembered the man who invited celebrities to dinner and walked through the streets of Harlem as a friend. But the man himself was now just a memory, resting in a quiet plot in Greenwood Cemetery, where the only sound is the wind moving through the ancient, towering oaks. Decades have passed since the glass shattered on Mulberry Street, and the city has moved on, burying the violence of the 70s under layers of glass and steel. Umberto's moved to a new location, and the original spot where Joey fell has seen 1,000 different faces pass by, most of them unaware of the history beneath their feet. The mystery of who pulled the trigger remains a puzzle with missing pieces, a story with multiple endings depending on who you ask in the quiet corners of the city's oldest bars. Some say it was a lone gunman, a ghost sent from the old world to settle a score. Others point to the confessions of men looking for a final bit of fame before they passed into the dark. But in the end, it doesn't change the stillness that remains. The world of Joseph Gallo was one of constant motion, of noise and fury, of a man trying to outrun a destiny that was written the moment he first stepped into the life. Now that motion has stopped. The streets are calm. The sirens have long since faded into the hum of the night. The stories of Crazy Joey have become nothing more than a soft murmur, a flicker of a shadow in the corner of an eye, a reminder that even the most chaotic lives eventually find their way to a final, silent rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.